Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to thank Nada Ayad and Omar Berrada and the Interdisciplinary Seminar and Lecture Series for inviting me to share my work with you. I also wanted to thank Tina Jung and Mike Carrasquillo for coordinating the back-end details of my visit and the many people whose invisible labor make my virtual visit possible. So today, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides. And Okay, here we go. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the most recent book that I just wrote on US immigration crises in the 21st century and radical sanctuary movements. So I'm pulling together a lot of threads here and in a very short amount of time, and we are moving into a changing scene of challenges in the near future. So in line with this year's IDS themes, I hope that my comments today can incite us to think about the multiple convergent relationships among territoriality, layered sovereignties, embodied movements, both of social movements and of movements, bodies moving across space, and about those questions of scale. So where and how can ordinary people intervene when grappling with problems of a planetary scale? So I'm really looking forward to the discussion and thinking through these problems together. So on January 27th, 2017, the US White House issued the so-called Muslim ban, immediately barring the entry of all Syrian refugees, as well as any traveler from 7 Muslim majority countries. It came on the heels of 2 other executive orders, one authorizing a big, beautiful wall along the US-Mexico border, and another ramping up interior enforcement of immigration executed through ICE raids. These 3 executive orders represent an unprecedented executive attempt to alter immigration policy without congressional debate or approval. Together, they had defined our current approach towards immigrants through bans, walls, and raids. And together, they would be justified by vilifying immigrants as threats that must be expelled for our security. But this is not the whole story. On January 28th, 2017, within hours of learning that the Muslim ban had taken effect, thousands of ordinary people showed up at airports nationwide to fight this policy in particular and the new executive branch in general. These protests joined the mass demonstrations of resistance against the 45th US president from its first day in office and have continued in the form of litigation, defiant local jurisdictions, community defense committees, and more, and not solely for immigrants. So on the one hand, immigration had become the central platform of the president's efforts to make America great again, in part because immigration control is, as Kelly Lato Hernandez argues, one of the least constitutional and most racist realms of governance in US law and life. On the other hand, these attacks on immigrants do not stand alone. Alongside the ban, wall, and raids, the executive branch had taken aim at a range of ordinary people and the planet while promoting corporate capital, military investment, and law and order regimes. So while this regime fortified the violence tying our fates together, the targeted actions emerged from a shared foundation that stretches back to the United States' very origins. So to understand how did we get here, we need to grapple with the fact that those attacks on our neighbors and democracy were neither un-American nor historically unique. So this means 2 things. First, understanding these crises requires a deep historical understanding of bans, walls, and raids. These historical threads are rooted in the settler colonial foundations of the United States, the origins of federal immigration restrictions in the 19th century, and the escalating processes of criminalization in the late 20th century to the present. Second, the fact that these crises have been long building means that they will not end when the current administration does. The conditions that have allowed bans, walls, and raids will persist, even if what follows, like what preceded it, comes dressed in finer language and respectable politics, or comes accompanied by a woman of color. So if what's happening is not new, not normal, and not ending anytime soon, then what is to be done? So conceptually, I look to sanctuary, especially an abolitionist approach to sanctuary, as offering not so much a roadmap to these challenges as a capacious concept, a deep genealogy, and a recurrent social movement that can inform what can be done. Indeed, the terrors of contemporary immigration policy have invigorated the decades-old US sanctuary movement. Since 2016, the number of sanctuary jurisdictions jumped from a few dozen in 2010 to more than 600 in 2017. More congregations declared themselves sanctuaries, and the idea spread to new sites like schools, mass transit systems, restaurants, and even homes. And so it was no surprise then when the Trump administration attacked sanctuary as a site of resistance to his regime. So I want to think through the challenges and limits of sanctuary while also arguing for its significance in guiding the work ahead, which, as I just mentioned, is going to have to continue even though he's no longer in office. So not only does sanctuary carry an expansive genealogy rooted in the ethical demand to care for the other, but it also poses a fundamental challenge to state sovereignty, particularly of settler colonial states and their commitments to bans, walls, and raids. Sanctuary challenges state sovereignty in ways that might help us open our relations to each other beyond the dictates of national identity or citizenship. So in what follows, I'll very briefly outline the deep history of bans, walls, and raids, and then speak to how this history can inform a radical sanctuary movement that, in Angela Davis's words, grasps things at the root and links the struggles of targeted peoples. So as I go into the kind of deep roots in the historical section, I'm going to be covering several hundred years of history in like 10 minutes. So I'm seriously glossing over a lot of stuff, but I'm happy to come back to it in the Q&A. Okay. So in the book, I start each chapter with one of the executive orders and trace their deep histories reaching back to two foundational moments. The first is the settler colonial origins of the United States. Because it is a settler state, one built on the colonization of land taken from its original peoples, the United States needed migration in its early years to displace indigenous nations from their territory and to take possession of it. The need for settlers thereby created remarkably open immigration policies for Europeans. This settler colonization also required alienating indigenous people from their own land. Only European settlers could be identified as belonging to the land and the land belonging to him, as Letty Veldt states so well. And the settler logic of destroy to replace constitutes the organizing principle of the United States for everyone in it. In the US, the settler community is predicated on particular ideals of race, health, and ability. And because it seeks to be permanent and reproductive, it values heterosexual families that reproduce idealized citizens and thus weaves gender and sexuality dictates into its ideal. So settler colonialism brings together social norms around race, gender, sexuality, ability, health, and so on. As Lionel Hernandez argues, settler colonial societies strive to exclude racial others by deporting, hiding, or criminalizing them, or otherwise revoking the right of racialized outsiders to be within the invaded territory. Put differently, settler colonialism is central not only to the destruction and the condition of resistance of indigenous people, but also to the exclusion, containment, and removal of racial others who do not fit into the ideal settler society, which in the United States has always been defined by whiteness. For example, we can see these racial roots in the 1790 Naturalization Act that limited citizenship solely to free white persons. Even American Indians born outside US territory were barred from naturalizing. Settlers exclude these racial others, even while relying on them for their exploitable labor to build and sustain an idealized settler community. We can see this very obviously in the history of slavery and in the US Constitution, a document of our core principles, which commanded that any self-emancipated Black person be returned to their masters. Essentially, US democracy was built for free white persons on the theft of land from indigenous people and on the enslavement of African descended people. Every law that has expanded the terms of inclusion, like the 14th Amendment, has modified these fundamental exclusions. And so fully coming to terms with this fact requires acknowledging that US liberal democratic principles fester at the roots of our current condition. So the Constitution isn't the solution to our problems, it is in fact part of the problem. So in addition to settler colonialism, each chapter also reaches back to the 19th century foundational emergence of federal immigration restrictions, which have always been shaped by racism, capitalist labor exploitation, fears of disease and disability, and so on. And we see these origins in the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which targeted Chinese women and workers, incorporating gender, class, and racial-based exclusions into this original ban. And so this is a very typical kind of political cartoon in its racist depiction of Chinese men as threats to the nation, represented here as a white woman in Victorian clothing. And it's from this point that we see the start of the immigration bureaucracy, the need for documents, border and customs inspectors, deportation infrastructures, and migrant detention. So excluding, deporting, and detaining immigrants were all ratified as fully constitutional by the Supreme Court during this era, and these Supreme Court precedents stand to this day. This infrastructure targeted Asians as the quintessential illegal aliens. And while the racial target has shifted, the structure of racist exclusion and removal remained consistent. Furthermore, once it started, the federal government got on a roll. It quickly turned to target any convict, lunatic, idiot, or any person likely to become a public charge within months of passing the Chinese Exclusion Act. Over time, Chinese exclusion expanded to the rest of Asia in 1917 and then to the rest of the world in 1920s. The 1924 Johnson-Reed Act was the first globally comprehensive anti-immigrant restriction. It banned Asians altogether and radically reduced the numbers of permitted Southern and Eastern European immigrants, particularly targeting Jewish people, who were vilified by Senator Albert Johnson as filthy, un-American, and dangerous. When signing the act, President Calvin Coolidge remarked, "America must remain American," a call echoed in the demand to make America great again. Adolf Hitler found inspiration in US immigration policy for a racially pure fatherland, as he wrote in his memoir, Mein Kampf. So fascists and Nazis, literal Nazis, here and abroad, have long looked to US immigration policy for its inspiration. We don't need to go abroad to look for fascist roots. So simultaneous with the Johnson-Reed Act, Congress created the Border Patrol, which targeted Mexican migrants from the beginning. Congress also passed a law that criminalized crossing the border without authorization, ultimately sending more Mexicans to federal prison than any other law, leading to a Mexican immigration prison boom that rivals what we are seeing today. So the so-called tribal 20s marked the most restrictionist era in US history, characterized by xenophobia, Jim Crow segregation, the Klan, and the doctrine that America should remain American. It is thus unsurprising that former Attorney General Jeff Sessions aspires to return the US to this period. So as he laments here, the 1965 Hart-Celler Act finally eliminated racist national origin quotas. And while it did increase immigration from non-European countries, the Hart-Celler Act also imposed numerical restrictions on the Western Hemisphere for the first time, despite deep histories of cross-border connections, leading to the increased illegalization of Latin American migrants. But restrictions have never achieved their goal or stopped people from moving across borders, whether Chinese workers in the 19th century or Latin American migrants in the late 20th century. Officials have long known that border policing and walls don't work. In 1927, Labor Secretary James Davis stated, "We couldn't stop them. Not even a Chinese wall, 9,000 miles in length and built over rivers and deserts and mountains and along seashores, would seem to permit a permanent solution. And yet, the US has pursued these failed policies with ever increasing intensity, especially in the era of neoliberalism over the past 50 years. This amped up enforcement and escalating criminalization finds its structural roots in the same period as that Hart-Celler Act, with 1968 as a pivotal year, marked not only by revolution and counter-revolution, think like the Panthers versus Nixon, right? But also by a massive global recession and the end of the golden age of US capitalism. The convergence of these social and political economic convulsions paved the way for a radical restructuring away from military Keynesianism to neoliberal policies that invested in capital, divested from labor and society, and dealt with the fallout of that organized abandonment by disciplining surplus populations, justifying all of this by capitalizing on fears of economic insecurity and displacing them onto scapegoated others. So let's go back to this Jeff Sessions quote, right? So he's pinning the decline of the US middle class on increased immigration from that 1965 act, right? And while he's doing this, he's completely diverting our attention from these structural roots, right? The evisceration of the welfare state, the constant concessions to corporate capitalism, et cetera. So with their pervasive adoption, neoliberal policies have disenfranchised and dislocated regular people in the US and around the world, left behind by decimated economies and disappearing jobs. As Ruthie Gilmore argues, such people already in the United States and moving to the United States were subject to these same forces. Those left behind were stuck in space, lacking the social or financial mobility to follow capital, while international migrants in the US, pulled across the territory by the same forces that were producing the US cataclysm. So how does the state deal with all these dislocated people left behind by its organized abandonment? The answer has been to invest more and more into policing and imprisoning those people, those surplus populations. And so this is why Gilmore argues that the neoliberal state is built on prison foundations that have targeted and ensnared millions of working class Black and brown people, citizen and non-citizen alike. So in terms of solidarity, this also means that people who are documented not to work, the 65 million or more who have been through prison, as well as those who are not documented to work, the immigrants vulnerable to criminalization and deportation, have the potential to make an enormous power base. So while the book goes back to the US origins, it also picks up speed when we get to this era of neoliberalism in the 20th century. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but I trace laws and policies passed from Reagan to Obama, marking several key turning points like 1986 with the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which provided both a path to citizenship and more intense enforcement that has led to the very problems we're facing today, right? So this is a clarion call lesson for what we're approaching right now under the Biden administration. Reagan also passed anti-drug abuse acts, which were notorious for installing massive sentencing disparities between crack and powder cocaine. That's what they're famous for, and for fueling mass incarceration. These acts also targeted immigrants specifically by creating this thing called the aggravated felony, which can make even documented immigrants, like people with green cards, deportable for infractions as minor as shoplifting. In 1996, we have Clinton, who basically tore apart the welfare state and passed two very terrible anti-immigrant laws, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which we must repeal, and an anti-terrorism act in the EDPA. He also passed this policy called prevention through deterrence, which you might have heard about in terms of thinking about the all the deaths in the Sonoran Desert. The prevention through deterrence meant escalating law enforcement at the traditional crossing points like near San Diego, Tijuana, or El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, and then funneling migrants to go through the very dangerous desert death was built into its logic, and 2020 was the most deadly year for migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert. Under Bush, we obviously had the war on terror, the creation of DHS, ICE, and CBP, which linked national security and immigration issues into this kind of Gordian knot. And then with Obama, we have his felons not family policies that divided off good immigrants from bad immigrants, like those who cross the border without deportation, right? And again, this is one of those kind of logics that we need to really dismantle going forward. Okay, so the point of going through all of this history is to show that the Trump administration didn't innovate as much, so much as it built on already robust foundations. We have been living with aggressive policing, miles of border barriers, raids, anti-Muslim racism, mass trials, and the separation of children from their families for decades. So the history of bans, walls, and raids brings together these vectors of power around race, gender, sexuality, national origin, religion, neurodiversity, and physical disability. In other words, the state has long been making the connections for us. It already has an intersectional analysis, if from the dark side. So the problem was never Donald Trump. The problem is the United States of America. And so while 45's actions weren't new, they made clearly visible the fundamental problems seething at the foundations of the United States. They have also incited more people to oppose that rising regime, right? Not just Trump, but white supremacist fascism, right? Many under the banner of sanctuary. So as this historical outline shows, multiple oppressions work together and thus demand multi-fronted struggles. So while recognizing its limits, I argue for sanctuary's potential, in particular an abolitionist approach to sanctuary that can help us not only defend communities right now, but also help us envision and build the future that we deserve. So for the next section, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the genealogy of sanctuary. I'm going to talk about the genealogy of abolition, provide a critique of liberal versions of sanctuary, and then go into kind of my argument for an abolitionist version of sanctuary. Okay, so let me start then with sanctuary. So sanctuary's millennia-old history and contemporary iterations reveal its fundamental confrontation with sovereign power and the potential to contest state violence via multiple positions, including local jurisdictions and religious spaces. It offers a capacious concept with roots in religious and ethical genealogies that it carries with it, even into secular contexts. Defined as a holy place, a place that offers refuge, and even since 2018, a city of refuge, sanctuary denotes a spatial notion, a place of protection or safe harbor. It also includes the practices of protection beyond the law, signaling its fraught relationship to the state. Sanctuary practices stretch back through recorded history, and variations are found across religious traditions. Indeed, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all root their origin stories in sanctuary, in the stories of Exodus, Christmas, and the Hijrah. The concept is also found in the holy demand that we treat the stranger with hospitality, as if they were our neighbor. Indeed, as Michael Schmaltz emphasizes, in the New Testament, stranger and neighbor are synonymous. Sanctuary movements also trace their roots to Greco-Roman and medieval Europe. Churches granted sanctuary to fugitives from blood feuds and from harsh government punishments, grounding their ability to grant mercy in divine powers that prevail over any civil authority. These fugitives were not always sympathetic figures. They included people who committed serious offenses, like murder. But by the 16th century, the fact that sanctuary existed as an alternative space and practice threatened the state. With sanctuary spaces carving out so many small sovereignties and undermining its exclusive territorial control, the modern nation state consolidated its power in part by eradicating sanctuary. The legal systems then emerging, based on liberal notions of political egalitarianism, purportedly ensured fairness for all people and thus claimed that sanctuary enabled wrongdoers to evade justice. And because it endows the state with the authority to determine justice without exception or alternative, political liberalism is antithetical to sanctuary. Indeed, sanctuary's eradication became a signifier of modern progress. However, though formally eliminated, sanctuary practices keep re-emerging because the equality of all persons before the law never came to pass, obviously. As we all know, while liberal political philosophy claims ideals of universal equality and fairness, these ideals never considered including in the community of equals those subjected to extermination, slavery, labor exploitation, patriarchal subordination, and so on. As Elizabeth Brunig argues, we did not trade mercy for justice. We find ourselves both unjust and merciless. So US history shines glaring light on the failure of liberal principles to secure justice for all. And so sanctuary practices emerge again and again. Secular and religious movements have given sanctuary to fugitives in need of safe harbor from violent threat. And sanctuary has been given precisely because justice would not be. Which raises another genealogical thread I want to bring in, that of abolition. The abolitionist movement to end slavery, the Underground Railroad, and the efforts to resist the Fugitive Slave Acts put sanctuary principles into action while seeking to upend a society built on slavery. Grounded in the authority of the US Constitution, the Fugitive Slave Acts put federal power and resources behind recapturing the self-emancipated and returning them to bondage. These laws further criminalize not only the act of helping fugitives escape from slavery, but also the refusal to help recapture them. But free Black people and abolitionists deployed both legal and grassroots tactics to resist these draconian laws. As Eric Foner highlights, Northern states passed laws barring officials from assisting in the kidnapping and returning Black people to slavery, and courts used writs of habeas corpus to prevent their return. Northern juries refused to convict defendants who violated the Fugitive Slave Act. Vigilance committees took direct action, storming courtrooms to free recaptured Black people and send them on the Underground Railroad. Churches, following the biblical dictate not to give to his master a slave who has escaped, provided sanctuary to Black fugitives. Abolitionists and formerly enslaved people defied federal law at risk of punishment or return to bondage to sustain the Underground Railroad, transporting and harboring tens of thousands on their northbound journeys to freedom and southbound. Following Stephen Best and Saidiya Hartman, they understood that, contrary to the state's narrative of the dangerous fugitive whose purpose is to justify police power and its authority to capture and kill, it is in fact state violence and brutality that created the identity of the fugitive in the first place. Abolitionists refused to concede to the state's sovereignty and its unjust laws that hunted self-emancipated people who were definitively excluded from the promises of US liberal democracy. The US state could not govern them. They had made themselves ungovernable. So the Underground Railroad and defiance of the Fugitive Slave Acts contrast against contemporary iterations of sanctuary movements, which often operate within the limits of liberalism, even though liberalism is fundamentally antagonistic to the concept of sanctuary. In holding off state violence for now, such liberal policies operate in a paradox. It is not possible to provide sanctuary while giving credence to the authority of the state. And yet some liberal sanctuary policies operate as if state recognition by the state that targets non-citizens will protect them from harm. Some existing sanctuary policies welcome good, law-abiding immigrants while further casting out bad, law-breaking persons. Chicago, where I live, for example, justifies its sanctuary policies in terms of policing, since the cooperation of immigrant communities is essential to maintain public order. This has been the tagline of the current current and former mayor. And this is the same police department that, as the Justice Department, which is no friend to Black and brown people, noted, does not enforce the law, but frequently operates outside of it. We can see this with Laquan McDonald. We can see what happened over the summer of 2020. We can see this in the fact that the CPD has run a domestic Black site where it has tortured confessions out of hundreds of Black people, most of whom remain in prison today. So in Chicago, immigrants merely suspected of a criminal offense or included in the gang database, which requires little more than wearing dark, baggy clothing while living in the wrong neighborhood, are not protected by sanctuary. So like terror watch lists that target Arabs and Muslims, gang databases operate obviously through racial profiling. So clearly we have drifted quite far from the historical meaning of sanctuary, which accepted anyone as deserving of protection without question. So by working within a framework of liberal democracy and even of law and order, these sanctuary policies shore up the notion that undocumented immigrants deserve inclusion in our communities, but implicitly concede that their membership is contingent. They have to be a good immigrant who submits to capitalist extraction of their labor and to the state's unjust criminal legal system. Implicitly, those other bad immigrants haven't earned the right to have rights among us. The defense of the good immigrant does not destabilize, but in fact strengthens the legitimacy of criminalization overall, even while demanding exception to it. But as the history of bans, walls, and raids show, what counts as a crime is not static, but is constantly shifting and indeed has been expanding over the decades. So regardless of how hardworking, family-oriented, and deferential to law enforcement they might try to be, any undocumented immigrant is a fair target. And here we see liberal sanctuary's core contradiction. Being a law-abiding good immigrant will not save you as long as the state gets to determine what it means to be a good immigrant. Indeed, as the impossible subject, the unauthorized immigrant is a person who cannot be in a problem that cannot be solved. They are the constitutive outside that defines the community of the included. As Lisa Cacho argues, the illegal alien forms the foundation of immigration law and therefore cannot be incorporated into it. The most such reforms can achieve is exceptions to the exclusions central to liberal governance. So what I would argue for then instead is heeding lessons from earlier sanctuary models like those emerging from resistance to slavery and from medieval Europe. How might the unauthorized immigrants' position of fugitivity, their transgression of the proper, their disruption and disorder, open up new possibilities of social life into what Fred Moten calls the fugitive being of infinite humanity? So while critical of its current liberal attachments, I'm not yet willing to abandon sanctuary altogether. Instead, I want to think through how sanctuary might enable us to communally defend people targeted by the state and capital, but to also rethink our notions of affiliation that can challenge the nation state and capital altogether. So by refusing to cooperate with unjust law and providing refuge to the targeted, sanctuary can conceptually work to destabilize the criminalization and expulsion of non-citizens and other vulnerable peoples. By providing local commitments, declarations of sanctuary enact a notion of belonging and relationality that isn't beholden to the sovereign nation state. Contesting federal policies, subnational sanctuary jurisdictions translate abstract human rights into concrete policies backed up by their institutions. Meanwhile, supranational formations like human rights regimes and international solidarity movements provide subjugated peoples alternative venues to demand justice beyond the nation state. We can see claims to such supranational formations in the We Charge Genocide campaigns that went to the United Nations in 1951 and in 2014 to protest the hyper-policing of criminalized Chicago youth. However, the fact that human rights institutions fail to rein in violations committed by sovereign states like the United States points to the limits of seeking recognition from institutional powers. So it's not like these youth on the bottom right corner of your screen expected the UN to intervene, but they used this action to document, testify to, and protest racist police violence, and to expose the impossibility of getting justice from any branch of the US state, right? We can't get it in the US, so we're going to go to this other route. More importantly, many of the organizers of the We Charge Genocide campaign shifted into movements to erase the gang database and to stop a cop academy from being built. These campaigns crucially unite immigrant justice and abolitionist movements that seek to tear down forms of state violence and capitalist dispossession, while demanding investment in institutions of community building, like schools and mental health centers, which were massively closed under former Mayor Rahm Emanuel. He closed about 50 schools in the South and West Sides, which are mostly populated by working class Black and brown people. So they are guided by radical analyses that grasp things at the roots, making demands on state institutions, but also looking beyond them, and indeed challenging their very legitimacy. Put differently, these organizers adopt strategies that grapple with criminalization itself, enacting an abolitionist approach to sanctuary. So an abolitionist sanctuary combines two concepts that might not seem to align. It connects sanctuary's radical welcome, its judgment-free embrace of anyone, to abolition, the social justice organizing that seeks to tear down oppressive power structures like prison systems and build a just, equitable world in their place, one in which we refuse to solve problems by resorting to violence or create illusions of safety for some by violating others. An abolitionist sanctuary combines the community defense that is needed right now with the deep envisioning and building of a new society where we welcome all of our neighbors. It is guided less by creating a space of safety for a select few. Instead, it seeks to create a society where no one, regardless of citizenship status, criminal record, poverty, ability, or any other factor, is discarded as unworthy of economic means, affirming social relationships, or political power. It strives for what is not yet here, even as it works under current conditions. Indeed, sanctuary's defense is necessary right now because we have not yet achieved the justice society abolition aspires to create. An abolitionist sanctuary thus operates in the time of what Best and Hartman call fugitive justice, between the no longer and the not yet, between the destruction of the old world and the awaited hour of deliverance. So the lines of solidarity, sanctuary, and contestation of United States sovereignty move in all directions across multiple borders. So in closing, I'll focus on one example of community defense right now that also encourages us to think about reimagining our relations to each other now and for the future. So as part of the massive airport protest that I began this talk with, members of the Tongva Nation joined with other Native peoples to host a welcoming ceremony at LAX airport for those migrants and refugees barred from entering the US by the Muslim ban. Welcoming the excluded, these indigenous activists asserted their claims to US lands as its original peoples and opposed any right the United States claimed to keep out others. As Nick Estes of the Lower Boulay Sioux tribe noted, welcoming refugees and Muslim migrants not only recognized their humanity in distinction to the United States, but it also contested the US settler state, which does not have the final say over who or what comes into the country or exclusive ownership over who and what counts as human. The United States, like all nation states, imagines that it maintains sole control and authority over its entire territory and everyone in it. This is its sovereign power. And the exercise of this authority seems so entrenched and ordinary as to be unremarkable. But this belief that US sovereign power aligns fully and seamlessly with its territory is not and has never been true. As the genealogy of sanctuary shows, there have always been spaces internal to the nation's territory where the state does not exert full sovereign power. in religious spaces where the sovereign state cannot intrude, or more recently, in sanctuary jurisdictions that contest the power of the federal government to dictate how we engage with our residents. The settler colonial history and contemporary condition of the United States further exposes the fiction that the US is the sole sovereign here. The land we ordinarily think of as the US, in fact, holds many sovereign nations. And these multiple sovereigns also expand visions of how to think about our relationships to both the place and the people who live in it, one that is not confined to notions of US citizenship. More important, the United States is not the original or rightful sovereign of this land. Acknowledging that the US exists on territory seized through settler colonialism raises the question of whether I get to claim this land as my own and whether I have the right to prevent anyone else from settling here as well, as the historian Elizabeth Ellis of the Peoria Tribe of Oklahoma argues. The right to exclude others cannot be granted to those living on occupied territory. There can be no ban on stolen land. So performing the welcoming ceremony as this land's original inhabitants worked, in Estes' words, to reclaim our sovereignty, our citizenship, and more importantly, our kinship. These native organizers draw on an indigenous politics that rejects the legitimacy of the US state and challenges the exclusion that define a nation's citizenry. They articulate different ways of relating to each other that are instead created by members of the community, particularly those dehumanized by the US, cast as illegal, terrorist, criminal, or expendable. Indeed, multiple indigenous nations offer alternative models of relationality and nationhood that may help us reimagine solutions. These models conceive of belonging and affiliation with each other through reciprocal obligations among humans and resources, one that sees consensual incorporation and inclusion as a way to expand power rather than as a threat, as Ellis notes. This means that sanctuary is not an act of charity for others, but of establishing reciprocal relationships with each other, with the original inhabitants of this place, and the land on which we all live. Many of us are the purported beneficiaries of systems that have not only dislocated people through economic and military violence, but that also criminalize and sweep away others for our supposed security. So this abolitionist approach to sanctuary has the potential to reconceive of membership and affiliation beyond the legal status provided by the state. It communicates to the excluded, the undocumented, the criminalized, the convicted, the outcast, that legal status means nothing. The only thing that matters is that you are here with us, which means I am accountable to you and you are accountable to me as well. So the solidarity organizing that drives sanctuary is about defending each other, but it is also about protecting the very grounds of our relation to each other, of the ability to defend each other in the first place. As the abolitionist organization Mi Gente declares, the only community of sanctuary is an organized one. And so as we move into this next phase of confrontations with power and challenges for the years ahead, I hope we can remember that our work is far from over, but will require all of us to find our lanes and build power among each other. And to that end, here's a couple of organizations that I believe are worth our support. I would also add Grassroots Leadership, which is based in Austin. And I will also say that the author proceeds from the book and from this talk will be going to some of these organizations. I think for this talk, we just started a mutual aid fund on my campus for our students who have been having a hard time with hunger and with making rent. So a lot of it will be going to that mutual aid fund. But these are other abolitionist immigrant organizations that I fully support, and I think we should all as well. So thank you so much for all of you for being here and to the IDS for the invitation. Thank you.